I did not start playing Outer Wilds with the expectation that I was going to make a video about it. I've actually had a bit of a history with the game, and in some terms, I was really only finally playing it to be able to say that I did. Since pretty close to its release on Steam, I've attempted many times to properly sit down and play the game. Every time I bounced off. Sometimes I made it further than others. Most notably, the furthest I've made it was probably my third attempt, where I managed to go a few loops and figured some things out. But I still ended up bouncing off the game pretty hard and didn't come back. And by all means, I thought that's where I would leave it. But then, many months later, probably midway into 2022, I got an itch. Damn. I want to hear that song that those guys play. So, I went ahead and listened to it on YouTube and satiated those urges. This ended up continuing for a while, and I found myself returning over and over to that YouTube page. It kept calling to me. I would be playing or focused on anything else, and still I'd frequently and randomly decide, God, I need to hear that banjo again. After a solid few months of this, I considered looking into the comments on the videos I used to listen to it, and realized, wow, these are littered with spoilers, huh? That was where I started to get the itch to finally give the game a proper final chance, where I sat down and just did my best to play it. Maybe it was in spite of my original opinion at the time, where I believed that I don't like this game very much, but I respect it, because I began to realize that by all means, I should love Outer Wilds. Everything about it seems like something that should stick out to me as genius, and a game I'd think about for years. Still, I ventured on and kept thinking about the parts of the game that bothered me in my first few attempts, which dissuaded me from returning. In my early attempts at playing it, I would generally get really stressed out by only having 22 minutes before time reset, specifically because it compounded with the issue that my brain would short-circuit when I was given too many choices as to where to go in a game. I personally needed a relatively direct form of guidance in 99% of cases. When I was retrospecting about my early experiences with Outer Wilds, I was forgetting something pretty important. My entire ideology surrounding things like exploring for its own sake or moving around without purpose has entirely changed in the year or so since I had last played it. I had changed into someone who actually quite enjoyed having an open space that's rich with things to take in and examine, but no core direction to go. So I finally decided to play the game again. I sat down and said I'm going to give Outer Wilds an honest try. And I did it. I beat the game in 2 sittings. I was pretty much glued to it the entire time, and I only took a break to go to sleep. And I don't know entirely how I feel about it, but I know I like it. I don't know why I like Outer Wilds. This title is surely a little sensationalized. After all, I have to figure out some way to make it interesting to people on YouTube, though it is also kind of the truth. As of writing this, I really can't fully figure out what it is about Outer Wilds that makes me really like it. For some context, immediately upon finishing the game, my thoughts were, oh, that was cool, and not much else. I was a little disappointed in some ways. I'd heard so many people, my friends included, describe it as amazing, some saying it was their favorite game ever, which made me feel, I guess, a little underwhelmed. I again returned to my thoughts where I respect the shit out of the game, even more so, but I guess it really wasn't my thing in the end. But then I kept thinking about it more and more. I'm currently writing this 2 days after finishing the game for the first time, recording it about a week after, so it's still very fresh in my mind, and my opinions on it have changed drastically in that time frame. Despite my opinions changing so much, I still, as mentioned, don't really know why I now like it so much, which is the real reason I'm making this video. I'm hoping that putting my thoughts into writing, taking notes on the many aspects and reviewing them over and over, will help me figure out by the end of this video what I enjoyed so much about Outer Wilds. Returning back to my progressing thoughts, I'll describe my immediate opinions in a little more detail. The reason I considered the game to be just fine by the end was more a balance of opinions than a grand statement, I guess. I'm not sure if that makes any sense, but to try and explain myself, at that point, there are a lot of specific aspects of the game that I found very compelling and cool. Things I'll name and explain later, but importantly, I considered the game to have a lot of positives. However, there were also things that stuck out that really irked me at the time. Most specifically, I think my experience on Brittle Hollow was what kind of soured me on the game. Basically, I was salty about falling into the black hole over and over again, which is in hindsight Obviously my fault and not the game's, but it irked me enough that I felt it was representative of some of the aspects I found undesirable in the game as a whole. At the time, I had actually considered that incident was more indicative of the general problems with the time loop as a mechanic for me. I started to really dislike making a slight error and being teleported into the depths of space and having to navigate my way all the way back to where I was. The aspect of that actually bothered me the most was having to do it under a time limit. With more rational thoughts and the gift of hindsight, I now understand much better that those 22 minutes are actually very forgiving, and in a lot of ways, I now actually consider making those trips back to planets to actually be more of a positive than anything. And that actually concludes my negative thoughts about the game at the time. More or less, that's all I can remember that really I outright disliked while playing. And it turns out that those dislikes barely hold any water only a couple days later. With that out of the way, I'd like to discuss what I did like about the game, because hopefully after that, I'll have a pretty good idea of why I liked Outer Wilds. So first, I found figuring out the individual planets and moons and exploring them to be very interesting. All of them had their own little gimmicks and quirks that affected how you'd explore them and progress through them, which was something I ended up finding very enjoyable. Not even necessarily just the planets themselves, because all of the settlements and ruins all had their own little elements to them. This ties into a related element of the game, which is how it teaches you the methods of bypassing these various obstacles, and in turn, finish the game. Which, just to make fully clear for those who may not know, this is primarily done by reading ancient text that depicts conversations, notes, diaries, and all sorts of things from a previous civilization. This is done very naturally, as in very few cases it's ever spelled out as something like, "Wow, traveler, to bypass the anglerfish, make sure not to make any noise because they can't see, they can only hear." It's usually far more natural than that. In this example, the way that you learn not to make any noise around the anglerfish is through an exchange between children who are playing a game based upon them. Here's that excerpt on the screen for you. I'm gonna say it again, this is a very natural way that the game conveys this information to you without making it feel very video gamey at all. It's just dialogue that happens to be helpful to you. And that is something that's very difficult to pull off, which makes me glad to report Outer Wilds does this kind of thing all the time. And while I actually didn't find the history and lore depicted to be that interesting to me, the ability of it to both feel natural and apply to my present experience in the game make it consistently compelling to read. And my eyes always lit up when I saw scrolls of text to read. I was always curious about what random interaction between ancient scientists would yield a teaching for me on how to reach distant locations that seemed impossible to get to. This, coupled with, as I described before, the planets all holding their own little mysteries, makes exploring feel very rewarding. On top of this though, the atmosphere in this game is one of the core features that I really appreciate the most. There are a lot of subtleties that take place while playing Outer Wilds, things like the way the HUD is depicted and it feels very immersive, or the slight ways your ship flies through space and interacts with the elements of the terrain, whether it be the real feelings of gravitational pull when flying around the planets, or the very real panic that I felt when I realized I was coming in way too fast towards the place I wanted to land. I guess my main point in this is that the game is immersive to a pretty unique degree. Besides certain things, it does very little to try and pull you out of the experience and remind you you're playing a video game. It really does feel like you are in this solar system, and it's you doing the exploration. This is where I think I developed a connection with the game, because while I found the writing and the way it's used to be very smart, as I mentioned, I didn't really emotionally connect with the historical elements, which comprise a pretty decent majority of what you encounter. I did, however, connect with the played experience of the game. Flying around and returning back to places I had once visited but with new knowledge, these are the aspects that I talked about disliking earlier, specifically that task of returning to planets frequently after either dying or for other reasons being kicked off of them. However, when I think back to it, I realize these experiences definitely helped develop my attachment to the world of Outer Wilds. Furthermore, while I've said a few times that I didn't connect with the written history you experience, I did in fact connect with the present characters and writing you find, the less ancient stuff basically. All of the travelers had their own personalities and elements that I enjoyed learning about, and even if my interactions with them were pretty slim, they all contributed to what was my number one favorite element of the game. I still love that goddamn song they play. In no small part, the Traveler's Song from Outer Wilds was probably the single core feature that actually kept me going in all times with it. Anytime I was getting frustrated with the game or unsure of my experience, I would just sit there and listen to the song, and then I would feel compelled to continue. For those unaware, the song actually plays a mechanical role within Outer Wilds. Scattered along the map, there are various other astronauts who are part of the same program as you. More or less, it's generally one per planet, all of whom are constantly playing their own individual part of the song. These can be found using your radio scanner thing, which, when aligned with one or more of them, will start playing their element of the song and display a distance. This helps build atmosphere, as I find it very cozy having them all play their music constantly that I can just listen to whenever I want. But it also serves a mechanical role in that it allows you to find each member with relative ease, as it's one of the few cases where you're given a very direct marker of where to go on a planet from the start of visiting it. Furthermore, once you reach a traveler, you can converse with them and learn a little bit about them and their relationships. But they'll also tell you places of note to explore on the planet they inhabit. I've described a lot of parts of Outer Wilds as genius, but I think this takes the cake for me as the number one element. It's such a perfect way to nudge the player along and give them some direction without, again, just directly telling them where to go from the start. Funnily enough, in my first attempts at playing the game, I think I outright just didn't understand this aspect, because now that I do, I realize the game does give you a lot of direction and ideas of where to go. But because it wasn't glaringly obvious to me back then, I either ignored it or got caught up trying to do something else. Circling back to the atmospheric elements of it though, I'd like to talk about the element that I think in no small part really did make me feel compelled to properly finish the game, which is that I wanted to hear all of these individual parts of the song put together while actually playing the game. And you can achieve this from the get-go if you'd like. If you fly to a far enough part of space and wait for long enough, eventually all the travelers will probably line up properly and you'll get to hear them all at once. It was fleeting. They only stay lined up for so long, and it got kind of annoying constantly trying to shift my view to catch the signals. But nonetheless it happened, and I was able to enjoy it thoroughly. I kept thinking about that part, and no matter how frustrated I would get with Brittle Hollow or trying to brute force my way onto the Black Hole Forge, I knew because of that segment where I was able to hear all the parts together, I knew there was a beauty to this game that was worth seeing through. Eventually, after many time loops, deaths, frustrated restarts, and hours spent reading, I was able to deliver the warp core to the vessel and found myself teleported to the Eye of the Universe, and I experienced the ending of Outer Wilds. I'll keep it 100 with you. I did not, and still really do not understand the ending of this game, at least from a narrative perspective. I do not fully understand what happens, why it happens, and what it means for the history of the Nomai and the future of the Hearthians. I've intentionally not watched any videos or read any analyses that explain it to me either, because that isn't the point that I did gather from the ending of Outer Wilds. What it ended up meaning to me was something very metaphorical and personal. I gathered up all the travelers around the campfire, including who I believe was the only remaining Nomai. I then had them one by one start their individual elements of the song, and I thought it was pretty cool, as I described earlier, but not much else. I now realize while writing this, what this ending, and I think the game as a whole, means to me, and I think I finally know why I like it. This ending segment of Outer Wilds is one that I am sure someone could spend hours describing all of the individual aspects and elements and how they really fully properly explain all of the lore that went just over my head. But to me, it depicts the core theme of the game that I took away, which is that even when there's catastrophe afoot, it's still worth it to stop and listen to the music. This isn't a mantra that's unique to this game at all. Hell, it's been a pretty big part of my philosophy starting this year. But the way that Outer Wilds depicts this, with the literal explosion of the sun always being only 22 minutes away max, and it still says to the player, yes, the universe is ending, but instead of trying to get stuck and stressed about it, Just try and enjoy your time, and stop worrying for at least a little bit. It's of course an over-the-top depiction of this idea, but I think it's one that really spoke to me. I've alluded to this applying all throughout the game in the way I described how the music would keep me both determined and interested in seeing it all the way through. Had I not taken those times to just stop and listen and enjoy it, I probably would have given up on the game. And this applies beyond the music. It's kind of the core gameplay loop of it all. Stopping and reading all the historical texts and the many pieces of information displayed to you, just trying to take it in the best you can, and so what if the world ends before you can see it all? Time just loops right back to the start and you can just head right on back there. It's a little funny, all things considered. The way that I initially found the constant returning and backtracking and pointless flying around to be a negative towards the game is at the end, I think, the reason why I like Outer Wilds. And that's all. Thank you for watching what will probably be my final video of 2022. I know I'm still starting off here and I'm pretty small, all things considered, but the growth I've seen already is something that I'm personally pretty proud of, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like and subscribe.